BioEthx Café. Café BioEth. Ethics, human rights, and decisions when science touches life.
Thank you very much. Welcome to the BioEthx Café. The BioEthx Café, my name is Carmen Larson. I'm your host for today. The BioEthx Café is an opportunity for us to reach out to our bioethics colleagues and listen to different issues and work that people are doing, and to learn a little bit more about things that people are doing in other places, how this might impact our work, and how we can perform our work in bioethics more effectively. So it's really a place where we can join in and talk about different issues that we run into. Today we're going to be joined by a human rights attorney, international consultant, Franco Sanchez, who has gracefully accepted our invitation to talk about his work in human rights, his ideas, and what it is, and how this might be related to ethics in healthcare, how it impacts it, what are the crossroads between human rights and ethics in healthcare, why we should care about human rights in general when we're practicing taking care of populations that are in need of assistance. Franco Sanchez is originally from Ecuador in South America. He has also served in various international organizations in Iraq during the war, as well as in other areas in Africa and Asia. And so he is joining us. I don't know, Franco, if I did you justice overall, but I'm sure you can tell us a little bit more about your background, and then let's get started. Welcome, Franco Sanchez, to our BioEthx Café episode for September 24, 2025. Thank you.
No, thank you, Carmen, and thank you for the ones that are joining. Can you hear me okay first?
Yes, it's perfect.
Yeah, sorry. No, thank you very much for joining this conversation. More than what Carmen said, I also have worked in human rights as a national official. At one time, I was Assistant Attorney General of Ecuador, and also work as Vice Minister of the Ministry of Justice and Human Rights. Meaning, and I'm saying this because the policy of the states and the policy of the government are an intersection, even if we're not talking about the justice system, with the systems that regulate some of the actions, including the ones in public health and also the individuals in human rights. So that's the context of that addition. So thank you, Carmen, so much. I wanted to go through a few concepts and principles in order to see how you that are more knowledgeable about the health profession or the health services profession and the intersection with bioethics and human rights. So the first thing that comes to mind to me is that when we talk about bioethics, we're talking about individuals at the beginning. So first, individuals meaning the patients or the ones that are receiving any kind of health provision or any service from the state in health, either way, an operation or assistance or guidance or recommendations, whatever the state, or in the case of in the United States and other places where the state does not necessarily provide health services directly and uniquely, the individuals that are in the private sector, which is mostly the case in many of the developing countries as well, where even though the state is supposed to provide, and this is why I started this way, supposed to provide the health assistance, it are the private practices the ones that actually provide the service. So when we talk about human rights, we talk about the access of individuals to the quality and the good quality of health services. The state is supposed to be, in most of the countries, the one that provisions that service, and that provisions the service to individuals, and it has to be at the best quality possible for that state. So individuals have the first right, apart from the right of life, the right of health. They also have another right, which is their provision of health services of the highest quality possible. So that gives two distinctions. One is the individual right, which is the access to health, which is a little bit programmatic, because we can say access to health is so general that don't actually touches a person in particular, but also the right to have the best service possible on health, which is even more difficult for a state or for provisions, even if they're from individuals or the private sector, to be provided. So when we talk about human rights, as you can see, one is programmatic. And then when we are in a case-to-case basis that you probably more interested to discuss, human rights intersect in a different way. So in order for this state to provide this individual the highest quality of service and to provide health as a principle, there has to be some regulations, and there has to be some practices, structures, and also methodologies to do so. One is the law needs to contemplate what are those rights and how those rights are exercised. And so the individual can respond, can use, and can also be knowledgeable about their individual rights. So leave that for a second. There's also the health services providers. There are also individuals, some of them, even if some of them are companies, they also have rights. They also are involved in individual rights of privacy, of the exercise of a profession with the highest ethical behavior and knowledge. And those need to be compatible, meaning that even though the individual has the right to the highest quality, also the provider has the access to or the definition of his own identity as individual to practice his profession or practice his service with the best of his understanding and with independence, which is very important. So independence that is part of the, not a human right as per se, but part of those regulations that make the human right of access to health services possible. So doctors, hospitals, committees, ministries, whoever is part of this, the environmental protection of health services have also their rights. So individuals in one side and also the providers in another side. So that's the first compatibility. So the desire and or the demand versus the supply. So who demands and the supplies and how those intersect. Both of them have rights in a certain way. So when we talk about individuals, going back a little bit and trace back a little bit to what does belong to the individual, apart from those rights that are general, they're individual rights. The first one that appears is the approval of, how can I say this properly? How a person can actually accept and have the free will to accept a provision and exercise that free will. That's the first one that comes to mind. So if there is a procedure to be determined that person needs to go through, that person has to have free will in order to accept that. And as many of you know, sometimes those individuals are not in the capabilities to exercise that free will. Either they are a physical impediment, they're not able to make the decision clear, or their mental capabilities are not there either. And those cases are the most difficult ones because the first initial free will and decision of the individual to receive those services can be somehow questioned. The other one in the same category is individuals that are, even though they're mentally capable, they're physically capable, they don't have the legal status to make that decision. For example, minors. The minors need to be represented by the parents. And then you add another layer to that decision that can be also questioned, that has to be put into consideration whether that comes into practice. So that's demand. From the supply side, you have the first interlocutor to a person that, and thus then you will see the bioethical dilemmas. What are the dilemmas that come into place when those two actors, in one side, the patient that has this free will or these decisions, and the other side, the provider, either a doctor, a clinic, a hospital, and then you can go all the way up to the decision makers in many ways, depending on the legal system that we are involved. In some is all private, and in others the state has a lot to say within those things. And even though in the private, there are methodologies that are suggested or imposed in order to have those decisions being recorded, properly fundamented, and properly exercised when they come along. So the provider. So the doctor has also some free will to exercise a procedure that that person thinks, that that doctor or that provider of the health service is capable of doing himself, is not capable of doing because his specialty is not in that direction. And if the environment, the place, the clinic, the hospital, the center has the capabilities to do so. So there's a decision also from that side where the decision of the doctor or the clinic or the set of doctors, a committee of doctors, is one of the things that we, I think, discussed one time. They have to record these decisions in order to come have this, cross with the decision of the individual. So to that, become the human rights of the individuals that are the recipients and the providers collide into a decision that needs to be, is the procedure adequate? Is the procedure accepted? Can be done. So bioethics comes, and the ethics comes when those principles do not match. Basically, the individual, not only as an individual per se, has beliefs, a religion, or simply does not trust the system and make decisions that may be against the health professions. Where, for example, if a minor, whose parents are from a certain religion, do not allow for blood transfusions. And if that blood transfusion cannot be exercised because of the free will or the decision of the individual that is to receive that procedure, or basically a blood transfusion, not even something complicated, an operation that needs a set of doctors that make a recommendation, is something a lot more simpler than that. And if they say, because of our religion, of our beliefs, we do not think that procedure should be exercised on our son that is a minor. Is the doctor in capabilities of denying that service or providing the service against the will of the parents? There are cases where doctors have actually decided to go ahead against the will of the parents and save the life, which is a human right, the access to life of an individual. And of course, without all the caveats or all the procedures that need to be in place, that doctor could have been in a legal proceeding in order to be accused of malpractice or discrimination or many other actions that go through that. So that's the first case and the first layer of when we're talking about ethics and how that dilemma that comes into place with our two positions in place that need a solution. The second one goes one grade more than the individual, which is the community. So the communities, and then it comes the church, the communities as a whole, the cities, or the legal framework of certain communities that can be states even, they have a certain limitations to how the practice is done in both sides, from the individual or from the demand and then the supply of the service. And then those regulations need to be followed, especially if there are laws that are imposed both in individuals but also in the health professions. So how those laws can affect even or can put a health provider into doubt that his recommendations or her recommendations can be put into place if they are the opinion, not just an opinion based on an investigation of a treatment or diagnosis that needs to be practiced in a certain way, and the state somehow or the regulations of the community may not be in the same direction, or the delay in time can actually be against the provider in one side, but overall to the recipient of the health service, that time states, communities that have regulations sometimes take too much time in order to do that. So because one of the human rights principles, which is access to health provision of services, access to health and services in an adequate time, this contradict the legal framework, contradict a provision or a policy of the state that previous a treatment has to be When this treatment is immediate, it's very difficult. You're not going to call the minister of something to see if a new procedure can be done when the person is about to die, or when the procedure is so traumatic that can have consequences in the individual that are no foreseeable in a way. So the confrontation or the difference or the intersection is sometimes only between the policies, the regulations, the laws, and the individuals and communities can be something that need to be taken into consideration, also one of the human rights, because we all have the free association, we all have rights, but also responsibilities as patients or as recipients and also providers. And then you have the bigger picture, which are the international regulations. Before going there, also the community has practices, especially in an area where there's not much legislation. Sorry, I was forgetting this very important thing. The new procedures and the new areas of intervention may not have any regulation. When they have a regulation and they are not, or they are against some of the things that individuals may demand or the providers will like to use, is one thing. But if there is no regulations, who regulates? And then some of the states have determined a self-regulation. Self-regulation by the Association of Medics or the Association of Health Providers, or advocacy against some of the institutions in order to accept new proceedings, and those can take also time, and they can take also some legal interferences. So when there is no law, when there is a hole in all this, the ethics becomes the only source of resolving any of those issues. So the ethical principles of the health provision and the intersection in human rights becomes the only way of having kind of a case-by-case or a jurisprudence of what had happened before in certain cases, in order to serve from what other doctors have done, what other providers have approached, what happened when this minor didn't want to receive, what are the legal consequences of not receiving of transfusion, for example. And that becomes the dilemma that is even bigger when there is no regulation, which is probably the case in most of when there are difficult cases when there is no regulation. And one layer more, just to stop probably soon, in order to see what are your thoughts and what are the things that we can add to the. I didn't want to make this a human rights speech, but more case by case of cases that might have come that have this dilemma, and how these thoughts could help to, or maybe you already know some of the answers. How can they be intersect properly? And then you have the international standards. The international standards or the global standards. Some countries actually have the standards themselves in a way that are the example for other countries to use that kind of the equipment, the facilities, the training, the decisions, the proceedings in order to make those decisions recorded, or how they use jurisprudence or cases that have been similar and how they can be used in a certain case. What are the arguments that some of the recipients of the health services have used in a legal proceeding in the case of a suit, and how these people have, which ones have been successful? What are the things that are not accepted by states or by nations or even internationally? So those are the only anchors that you can have internationally to see what others are doing as a practice. So what I've done is recollected these thoughts in something that John Paul Lederach, which is a practitioner of dialogue, and also is this like a bee cluster, where individuals are part of society, society represents a nation, and nations are international. These are all in the positive side, meaning that individuals are acting positively. There are also, as you can tell, maybe some individuals can, but we're not going to talk that today. Some of them may be talking in the negative side of the diagram. So maybe anti-culture, where dishonestly, for example, practitioners of plastic surgery that don't have credentials or that have practice with elements that are not supposed to do that. So that will defer these a little in the negative side. I'm putting on in the positive side because this, for example, is a little more useful, and how these intersect with each other in a certain way. So that's how Jean-Paul Lederach explains the interaction between the individuals and the international society can grow. And as we confront the dilemma of ethics, this can shift into the negative side, meaning that there can be probably no examples to follow, and there could be something to reflect on. So I'll stop there, Carmen, just to get a rapid sense of how the individual rights of both the providers and the recipients, how the structures at the community level, country level, or international level intersect with each other, and how the principles of human rights, which are basically access to education, the access to, or the right to live, or the right to die, which is something, examples that I didn't use today because I think will be too complicated, a practice to determine someone's the end of the life of someone, or the non-existence of someone. And those are dilemmas that are also contemplated in what ethics are, and go through the same principles. But those are principles of human rights that need to be taken into consideration, and some of them are common sense. Most of them are natural law, not necessarily written law, but something that is part of the ethical behavior of the health providers or even individuals that conflict sometimes with religious beliefs, with individual beliefs. And those are, I think, the biggest issues that we can bring forward when we talk about human rights and bioethics.
Okay.
Let's stop there.
Well, thank you so much, Franco. I wanted to ask, and anybody who wants to put in a question in the chat can do so, or you can, if it's not everybody together, we can take turns and speak up as well. There was a thing to raise your hand, but I'm not sure where that is right now. But anyhow, so I'll be watching and monitoring if there's a chat or if there's a hand raised. I wondered if you could tell us a little bit about if you had any experiences. I know in consulting and in the international sector on human rights, it's not necessarily at the level of the medical practice, I think. So it's more global, right? And did you have any experiences where you were looking at violations of human rights within the medical practice when you were in another country, or how have you had any of those kinds of experiences?
Not directly, because I worked basically with governments or with civil society, in the advocacy side. But I could witness when I was specifically in a Muslim country, where certain practices are not, with the interpretation of Islam of that country, were not, they did not want to create services. And I'm going to say very clearly, the female genital mutilation is a practice that is forbidden for for the legislation, but because of the individuals that were charged with the ministry to create clinics and services specifically to either, well, avoid first, then treat in the case of that, and isolate the individual. So it's not just a medical service, it's a social service that included medical services. They will not comply with the recommendations of the international community to provide a service that was needed, that was signed within an international agreement and within the law. So it was not against the law, but their religious beliefs did not want to enter into that conversation. Not that they were denying that there was something illegal or not, but they rather not take any action. And the percentages in some, especially the rural communities of that practice by the elders was very common, more than 80%. So it was a flagrant violation of human rights of women that have the right to express to have their body not being mutilated, apart from their sexual rights, which is something very different. So that was directly the denial of a state to provide a service that was required based on religious principles against international law.
So what was the mutilation undertaken in those countries? Are those undertaken as part of a medical practice? I mean, in other words, you go to a clinic to get that mutilation done, or is that something that's just done outside? I mean, I'm trying to compare it a little bit with circumcision practices where you go, the hospital does it, right? So in the female mutilation, is that similar in the fact that they used traditionally to go to a clinic to do that, or is that more done outside?
Both. I mean, some of that was done by elder women, but we knew of cases that doctors will actually do that practice.
Yeah.
Of course, in a country where there's no regulation, where there's not a medical association, there is no ethics committee, where there's no any kind of professional self-control or approval or the profession. So yeah,
Okay.
maybe it's not
All right.
applicable to wider thing, but just to put a very dramatic example of a violation of human rights where the state denied the service not to do or not to do that, but to mitigate, which is also a way of seeing human rights, mitigation of a violation as opposed to the practice.
Okay. I have a question in the chat. In your opinion, what is the first human right? What is the priority of the human right? The right to life or the right to liberty? Not sure how, but you can tackle that one.
So that's a question that takes a semester in constitutional law.
Can you answer that in 3 minutes or less?
No, but basically, human rights, because of and there's a principle of human rights that they aggregate to each other. So there is no competition which one is more than other. They aggregate. So and someone will say, well, the main human right, that is the right to live, can be not respected by a state when they have capital penalty and someone dies or someone is killed by the state because committed a crime. Well, there's a procedure for that. So it's not that there's no the right to live. Is that there is a procedure to exceptionally irrespect the right to live when the state has within the constitution and their laws the right to, through due process of law, make that right, the right of to live, not as important as others, because that's the same principle. So they aggregate to each other. So there's no more importance of any human right. They all aggregate. So the right to live and the right to express themselves are complementary. Very easy to say, but difficult to practice in certain places, or in certain cases, especially. So the freedom of speech or the freedom to act, it goes on top of the right to live.
Okay.
In order to avoid that, there has to be a procedure to determine if one can be avoided or not.
Okay. So I have another question here. Do the states have a responsibility to ensure ethical medical research that respects human rights?
It goes both ways. The laws and regulations are to be followed, but also the responsibility is not a state. The state is not the police of every action of every profession. I think locally sometimes the malpractice is the one that is put forward as the example, when in reality most of the actions are done with good practice. So the state puts the regulations, the individuals are to follow, and if they don't, and if there are cases, individual cases, and locally, not general, unless there is a general practice of a certain sort, the resources are for the individuals to either enjoy, to use, or to avoid, and that's something that goes through the ethical behavior of professionals in order to follow those regulations.
Okay. Okay, great. So if we are obviously there in the medical research, there's more of a concern on either getting the sample or the people who are going to be used as a control or as the people who we're targeting in the research, to make sure that we are being inclusive of the different population groups that need to be taken care of, so different communities. I think that there's more of a link between human rights and medical research, perhaps. And then when you go into the clinical ethics, that's more on an individual level. It's more dependent on current local legal things rather than the community. Is there a relationship between public health and medical research and human rights? What is that relationship about?
The relationship goes like a pyramid. So the policy of the state is that practices, let's say, or any biomedical action should follow certain principles. Those principles are, amongst them, they need to be based on evidence, and evidence goes through research and all of those things, right? So one element of making decisions or accepting practices or act in a certain way is to have appropriate evidence and appropriate research that accompanies those procedures. So I assume that an ethical responsibility of the medical profession in this case is to do whatever is needed in order to have access to that evidence, to practice that, not to do because you think is supposed to be done, but based on other cases, based on the regulations, based on the practice, and not just the imagination of one individual. So that's something that can be controlled. The state can have limitations to that, but also I think that self-regulation of the medical profession, either at the community level with associations of, this happens in the lawyers as well. I mean, the lawyer's practice goes through the bar, and then you can be disbarred if you have malpractice. And that the state doesn't necessarily do anything about it, other than make sure that there are procedures and there's due process of law in order to do that. The same in the medical profession, any other profession. You have, there are associations that allow for certain elements and certain practices that need to be, and regulations that need to be in place to do that. In order to do new things, I think research is a must, but that's something that, of course, it depends on the resources that the state or the individuals or the community has in order to do that.
Okay. Do you think, so a question, do you think that is in the United States there's a practice, and I'm sure there's in other countries as well, to leave the research to the major companies that maybe have a conflict of interest because they're trying to sell a particular product or not? Is there an ethical issue there or a human rights issue to demand that there's some kind of impartiality in deciding this is of course a hot topic now, right? Is it right to leave it up to the companies that are either selling a product or a pharmaceutical to decide what's the best way to treat something? I mean, anybody can jump in and contradict me on this because I'm not.
This is a very, very difficult question, because you can see right. France, for example. France is fully regulated. In France, any research is owned by the state. There is no individual companies that can do research on medical practices because they see the medicine as a service. Some may say that in the United States, on the other hand, even the French president, not that I think that, but they said that in the United States, medicine is a business. And as a business, nothing wrong with that, has to do all is needed to be a sustainable business in time and the best possible business that can provide a service. And of course, the course of action in those two nations are very different. In France, everything is regulated to the extent that it's very difficult to do anything that is not regulated. In the United States, it's the opposite. Only certain things are not permitted, the rest is all permitted. And therefore, the research, the studies, the practices, and many things are done individually. if you qualify the services, not the price, but the services, both nations have top of the line services. So it's very difficult to say which one is better in a sense. Access, affordability, that's a different issue. But the best doctors in the world probably are in those two nations. One with a lot of regulations, other with not as much. So
So we don't know. Okay. I wondered if I could invite some of our participants, our guests, to ask a question. If you can unmute yourself and feel free to introduce yourself and ask Mr. Sanchez a question that you might have about his experience in dealing with human rights in general abroad and how that might have an impact in your practices in bioethics. Is anybody in the audience want to ask a question?
There's one question on moral traditions and how those, which one takes precedence. It's very difficult because, for example, even within the provision of services, there are hospitals that belong to, let's say, the Catholic Church that does not believe in certain things, or any other religion, just to not be pointing out to any particular. Religious and moral are very similar. Morality and religion are very, very close together, let's say. What takes precedence if the hospital doesn't want to practice something that is permitted by the law? I mean, the individual should have the choice not to go there to the hospital or not to have the provision of those services and ask for another one that will do it. You have as an individual the choice. So there's no conflict there. You just choose another hospital. But not everybody's in the same position of saying, I don't want this service because, or I want this service and the cost may be not affordable. He doesn't have access to that one. And the law can only tell you, and the regulations can only tell you so much. So that's where the bioethics, this is exactly the point of bioethics discussions. If there are precedents or practices and doubts and dilemmas, that's the space of bioethics that we are exploring as we speak. And case by case, the moral issues, the legal issues, the human rights issues, the self-regulations, whichever is the system that is in place, bioethics is all about that. Solving the dilemma and basing your decisions on some references, either legal, moral, practice, and others. And I think that's something that if I could summarize what I've said is, all of these are elements of this that contribute to solving the dilemma. And yeah.
So I want to chime in on that. One of the things that bioethics, our organization is about, which is bioethics with an X at the end, is to promote the idea that it's a good practice to document bioethics cases and how you resolved them, what the factors were involved, digitally. In other words, to capture it in a digital way and organize the information in such a way that you can then look at precedents and you can look at cases that have occurred. So what we have essentially done is have come up with a framework that you can document a case like you could in a legal perspective, for example, say that this happened and these are the factors and these are the people involved and these are the issues. And then what things came into play when you were assessing the issue and what made you decide a certain outcome. And we are currently leveraging AI to look at those precedents, to have a repository of information, to take a look at, because when you're looking at the different decisions, you are looking at what is what are the personal autonomy issues and what are the clinical risks in taking one course of action versus another, and how does that impact the autonomy of the individual. So I think that if we're looking at looking at precedents in practice, it's very important to document these things in the process that you're doing, which goes beyond the electronic health record. So the electronic health record really does not approach the part where you're doing a bioethical assessment in terms of what's the legal implications or what's the legal impacts or what are things that are going into the decision making or the assessment of recommendations, and what are the family issues, cultural or religious or otherwise. So anyhow, in terms of having a better way of assessing precedents in practice depends on our bioethics practitioners' willingness to adopt a standard way of documenting these things in a digital data organized way that can allow us to look at trends, the trend analysis, and what outcomes happened in previous cases. I just wanted to chime that in because I think that's one of my passions, is to find a way that we can all agree on documenting cases, whether they're our own cases or whether they're historical cases or things that have been published, in such a way that we can learn from our good experiences, best practices, or bad experiences, lessons learned. Okay. In the meantime, I'm going to ask you, Mr. Sanchez, what are the things that you thought were the biggest challenge in your practice internationally that were related to human rights? What were the things that you were facing? What was the most common issues that you were facing when you were out there providing services and consulting?
So the biggest issue about human rights is that most of them are not directly applicable. So meaning that there are a set of principles, they're in the law, they're in the constitution, they're in international treaties. But in order to enforce them, you need the internal legal systems of every country. And sometimes those legal issues become more, or they become case-based and forget the bigger principle of human rights and go through what the country is going through at that particular moment. And it can change, even a principle so important like abortion, for example. The United States, that had since many, many years one direction, it changed to a different direction. And that's something that evolves with, even though the international human rights go in one direction, bigger for everybody, the countries themselves have different practices. There's no abortion, for example, in Latin America that is permitted in the same way as the international human rights, for example, of the self-determination of a woman. And then that's something that conflicts with the right to live. And as I said, the individual rights are agglomerate, they add to each other. In this case, there are, and some of you may have thought, there are contradictions. There are contradictions that are solved in a certain way where reasoning and ethics and practice solves those dilemmas and problems. So the biggest issue about human rights is go from the principle to the practice, go to the enforcement on some of those. And in the case of health, saying that an individual has the right to access to health, the best quality of health, is not enough. The regulations, either self-regulations by the different bodies or the regulations of the state, need to be a little more specific, not just to the medical practice, not just certifying medical professionals and medical services and others, but also the access to information in order to have the best practices possible, as you said, in order to apply them in the profession as a reference and how the profession can grow without individuals against individuals, but a community of practice of a group in a certain time. So that's the biggest, in any case or in any issue of human rights, the biggest problem or the biggest difficulty is how we make those rights effective, or how do we enforce them in a certain way. And I think part of what we're discussing today has pointed out some ways of how can you pretty much bring out of the sky to land some of those principles into practice.
Yeah, here we have a comment, and that an example is conducting research in teenage pregnancy. In some countries, it's illegal, yet this is also a very vulnerable group. So teenage pregnancies are people who are adolescents, and then the autonomy of an adolescent is always in question, whether they have the right to have their autonomy and their privacy as an adolescent. Is this something that you see a variation a lot from one country to another, or has this been something that you've run into? Where,
So
yeah.
not the specifics, but the vulnerable groups are usually the ones that are advocating, that are trying to put their principles or their cases forward in order to be recognized. LGBT cases, or minors, or women, or indigenous communities, those are the ones that are always not favored by the national policy. And that contradicts, of course, their human rights in many levels: the individual rights, the programmatic rights, and also the general human rights. And that happens in every state. Every provision of services of any kind always lacks that. If you go into any of them, there will be some kind of a lack of action from the state. But that's something that has to do with the budgets and the research and the access of those individuals.
So we have a comment that a while back, some years back, there were veterans, just in the UK, there were UK veterans that were part of nuclear testing, that because they were 20 miles from a nuclear test site and they're trying to get compensated by the state. How would human rights handle that today?
In that case, the individuals or group of individuals can present a case against the court of law and provide all the evidence. And then that judge or group of judges, within the legal framework, within the evidence that is provided between the other indications in the law, will apply, including some ethical issues into this. So this is, they can be successful or not. That's something that will that be determined by the court of law. There's one case in Vietnam, for example, where Agent Orange, that was used by the United States back in the 70s, is still present, and some of the effects of Agent Orange have been you can still see in the population: mutilation of limbs or any other either mental health issues. Without any plaintiffs or any kind of case against before a court of law, the United States have decided 15 years ago to start a compensation to individuals and reparation of the things in Vietnam. So there's no need only to have the ruling of a judge. Also, a nation or a group or a community can decide that, because of ethics, mitigate the effects of a certain violation. The use of a gas that or an element that was against, that could have been framed as a war crime, is being reparated even now, even 50 years later, 55 years later. They're still mitigating the effect in land, the effect in individuals, and compensating some individuals because of that violation. So either before a court of law, or through advocacy, through a policy of a state that provides a service, that's something that can be pursued. Yeah.
We have a hand raised from Mr. Ayakpour. Please go ahead.
Thank you, Carmen, and thank you, Mr. Franco, as well. My name is Ellie, and I am originally from Ghana. And so I'm curious to get your perspective on an area. I know you talked a lot about abortion, genital mutilation, and some of these examples that you cited. And growing up in Ghana, these were some of the things that were frowned on. But due to religious beliefs, some of these things were being carried out in order for some reason, one or the other. My question to you is that in recent times, from your perspective, where do you see some of these religious beliefs coming into play when it comes to genital mutilation, abortion for young girls across several countries? Where do you see that happening? And also, what are some of the medical practices, bioethics, that are taking in place? And if medical practices these days does supersede over religious beliefs? I know that was a lot being asked, but hopefully you can answer the ones that
Sure.
you have
There's
experience with.
no right answer, right? There's no right answer. I think the ideas that we are discussing today, and we will continue discussing, are exactly about what you're saying. What can be done? So the same from the international community. If I go against or the other direction from the graphic that I showed you, from international community to the community to the individual. So from the international community, there are a lot of reports that there are special rapporteurs in many of these sexual violence, for example, and there are reports country by country saying, we recommend the states to take action here and here and there. We recommend the legislation of certain nations should be going in this direction. There are model laws in order for them to adopt and then put into practice. So that's the international. Nationally, the regulations from the country, actually, some of them are not that bad. They're compliant with the international recommendations. Then, when you go to the individuals and the small community and the family, the practices is something that is very difficult to change. I think that's what you're referring to. Moral and religious or community practices or tribal practices of certain issues that continue. Very difficult to avoid them, very difficult to confront them, and to put pressure in order for change, because that's a change of a generation. So the only thing that can happen is, or how can some countries have started, is with mitigations, with information, with campaigns against these practices, and campaigns that actually give a woman access to information, access to medical services that actually can prevent them from becoming pregnant at an early age, or becoming mothers when they're not ready, or to communities showing them that female mutilation actually causes death in many of the things, and that there are other, I mean, without going to the rights, not only the reproductive rights, but also the sexual rights of individuals. And those layers need to put enough pressure. So policy and practice differ clearly. What can we do? We just continue putting, as we're doing, creating a space for advocacy, put forward some of these principles as principles that need to be somehow enforced or adopted by some of the states, but at the smaller, not to go too far, at the smaller scale, in our own community, our own practices, our own moral things, how can they be, these discussions can be put forward if that's the case.
All right, so we have two more questions here. One is from Mercury Shitindo, who has her hand raised, and then we're going to follow that up with a question that's in the chat from Kalina Kamenova. So we'll start with Mercury. Go ahead.
Mercury Shitindo, Director for Africa BioEthx Network. Mine is more of a comment, it can also be a question. I'm just wondering, what are some of the strategies you might be having in place for reaching the... Sorry, I was saying mine is more of a reflection or a comment, whichever way you'll see it. Can you hear me? Or yes. I'll try and write in the chat. Okay. So I was saying, as the example I had given for the teenage pregnancies, what are some of the mechanisms you have in place to reach vulnerable populations? For example, when you think about countries like Uganda, for example, where LGBTQ is illegal, banned, and people go to prison, you know. So what happens if some of these people need medical aid and need reach? They're like the teenage pregnancies, some might have been raped, but then even if it's found out, they can be stoned or they'll be punished. I don't know what mechanisms you have, but it's food for thought. Thank you.
You have an answer for that? I'm not sure.
So the whole idea of the enforcement of human rights, just to put something that I said already in maybe different words, is the international pressure or the advocacy groups internally. Let's say in Uganda, a place where many women cannot even own land because they themselves are property. So property cannot own property. So the violations of human rights are not cherished, but almost cherished by the state. And a state that does not want to break the equality of women and the acceptance of different groups that are not not equal to the majority, so to speak. So advocacy, learning, information, best practices is the only way to start that discussion. One thing that is clear for international human rights lawyers like myself is that countries have the right of self-determination. So each country has its own constitution, its own rules and laws that doesn't matter how much we speak, how much the UN wants to, when they agree, how much they want to convey them to do X, Y, or Z. It's the own country that makes those things possible or not. So internally, advocacy and use democracy as a tool in order to have better representatives that can contemplate, they can bring those realities in the ground and make them into the legal framework. Very difficult. I think that's what the Commission of Human Rights is trying to do, what international lawyers try to fight, but it's not something that can be said or done just by one individual. It may take generations.
Thank you, and I think we could probably talk a lot about that and how we should support that common view. The last question I have here is: do you envision from Kalina Kabanova? I don't know if you want to voice it, or I can read it for you.
I can see it. Yeah. So how international community works in these core bioethics frameworks, for example, international framework of recommendations. So there are many recommendations that they don't need to be a resolution to be enforced. For example, the rights of women that were declared in Peking in, I don't know, in the 90s were way before enforced in many countries without a resolution. The ethics of each country and each one of the groups, not necessarily countries, but international groups, I don't know, International Medical Corps, or internally any medical association or lawyers association can adopt any kind of behavior or any kind of framework that has to do with international principles. So there's no need of a UN resolution for things to come into practice. As a matter of fact, the United States is not part or wants to be enforced in any of the resolutions. So one of the countries that least internalizes the resolutions or the conventions of the UN is the United States. Nevertheless, the practices are sometimes of a better ethical and standards than the resolutions that come out of the UN. So the UN is just a set of recommendations. I think for our cases, more directly what we're talking about, any kind of harmonization that uses those points of reference in international, national practices are the practice that can become an example for others, as opposed to be the opposite suggested in the question, how the internationals can give us. Maybe we can have a JFK moment, what can we do for them instead of what they can do for us? And I think that's their answer.
Okay, so what can we do? In fact, what organization in the UN is responsible for agreeing or making recommendations on human rights? Which one is the organization that handles that?
So there is many, depending on what. I think all of them have the same mandate of having human rights at the base. So it depends on what you want from them. The WHO, for example, can be the World Health Organization. You can have the special, the Office of the High Representative of Human Rights, maybe is, even though they have normative responsibilities and jurisdiction, they also have normative, more general way of acting. And it depends on vulnerable groups. You have UN Women, you have for refugees, which has it depends on what kind of things you do. I think for the legal framework that is more about ethics, on medical issues should be WHO. But also the human rights, the Office of the High Representative of Human Rights or the Commission of Human Rights, it's some places that there's advocacy to be done.
Okay. So Kalina's question was referring to human cloning controversy and the inability of the UN to pass a resolution. Where was that managed out of for the human cloning?
I think it was the General Assembly at the time that considered this. Like it's a very complex issue. There was a proposal about reproductive cloning, and there seemed to be a consensus at the time. However, several countries came with an alternative proposition to include the so-called therapeutic cloning, which was used in stem cell research. So the countries with highly developed biotech industries objected to this. So it's very complicated. I don't want to take all the time, but I think it was the General Assembly.
Okay. So but that was the final question is what can we do? Sounds like what we can do is educate ourselves a little bit better, educate the community better. Is there an importance to having an international human rights initiative, and why is it important for us to participate in it? It sounds like, Franco, that this is more an issue of educating the communities or the people. Most people don't know, other than looking on TV, some tanks that say United Nations. They don't really understand what is United. Why do I care about United Nations? Why should we be paying money to these people? I don't know. What are your thoughts of what we can do to help having better common ground on human rights?
I think the entry points from bioethics should be a little more focused because, entering the UN is a monster that is, I think the UN is bigger than most of its states members in size and budget and many issues. So it's a monster that is very difficult to relate to. But I think what can happen is trying to do one of the questions suggests is to put bioethics and an international board or creating a space that can be a point of contact for these conversations. So if there's any conference or any space where a so-called board or group of experts or informal group, there are many of them have actually voice. No, they cannot vote, but they can attend the General Assembly even and give their perspective of issues of interest of today. So basically, artificial intelligence groups are already there. Some against, some for, some are for. I think bioethics, as the technology evolves, is something that is going to become more and more the issue. As the medical practice advances and the technology is used, soon we'll be talking about, artificial, they're already in place, artificial parts of our body that can be, and there's a lot of ethical issues through that, and because of cost, because of moral issues, because of that. So maybe having a space that is the conglomerate of the voices that have these dilemmas to solve is a space that can be created at the international level, at the national level, as some of the thoughts are already done, is the way to start. And then from there, see what are the points of intersection with other international organizations that may be doing the same or doing something like that, and knock the doors and the spaces where those organizations meet or where those things can be discussed. Being united first, and then of course education, campaign of awareness, and also bring forward regulations or ethical practices and information to the place, so other medical associations in the world in different countries can actually use those as part of their reference, or create a reference of what can be done, or something like that. I say many things, but I think that will be better than not the one organization that may not give you any response even.
Right. So thank you so much, everybody. Franco, we're delighted to have you here and to hear your viewpoints and your sides and your opinions. Thank you very much, everybody, for joining us tonight.
Thank you so much.
Take care. Bye-bye.
BioEthx Café. Café BioEth.